I would like to welcome everybody to the webinar, the Vilofoss webinar today, with the topic of energy in pig feed, an attempt to sort of try to explain some of the basics in nutrition, and what, from my experience, can be somewhat confusing, especially if you work across borders or across nations in pig feed, because different energy terms are usually being used in different countries. First of all, I'm just recapping what did we already present within the last year in pig webinars in Vilofoss. The last one was also a feeding guide on feed allowance and essential nutrients. Then my colleague, Dr. Arndt Schäfer in Germany, had a presentation on NutriSpar, how to feed pigs with less nutrients, mainly protein, but to some extent also phosphorus, as these products or these nutrients are environmentally challenging and limiting in many countries the pig production. Also, one of the colleagues, heat stress in pigs, and myself earlier last year had 2 sessions on weaning without medical zinc oxide. First of all, from the practical approach, from you could say the farm manager directly in the farm approach, and the second part a little bit more focusing on biology and nutrition. We will also host later this year, before the actual ban of zinc oxide in the EU, another webinar on weaning without the medical zinc oxide. But you will just follow our webpage and you will see the date as it appears. Okay, energy in feed. It's a little bit a strange term, because what is actually energy and where does it come from? I'll try to address that and explain that a little bit, and then also dive a little bit into different energy systems. What is the energy in the body? Because basically energy is energy, but it comes in many different forms. So I'll try to dive into how does energy actually work and is transported and utilized in the body. Then moving on to a little bit more practical approach, demand guidelines, animal groups, and eventually we'll look into how much energy is actually needed to make animals grow or produce milk and so on, to have an expression of life, so to speak. Energy, as said, comes in many different forms, and if you Google energy, you will come up with, well, at least when I did it earlier today, the first several hundreds of hits actually came up: windmills and solar panels and so on. But of course, energy is not limited to the energy, the power that we use for driving a car, heating our houses and so on. It is also needed basically to run life. And that's what this webinar is focused on, trying to give you a better understanding of what is energy and why can it be so confusing. Yeah. So you could say that energy is used in the body biologically to achieve a certain expression of life. And an expression of life means either gain or growth, protein, fat synthesis, or deposition at least. Work, when the muscles work, you need to move around, also that requires energy. Production of milk, lactation, again, it's related to the gain, protein and fat synthesis. Also lactose, of course, and other molecules, and also at the end, actually just transporting dedicated molecules around in the body. It could be as a part of the immune system. So there's many different energy-related questions when it comes to life expression. The important part is, even though we often treat it as such, energy is not considered a nutrient, because energy is actually chemically bound in protein, fat, and carbohydrates, which usually make out the nutrients that we are working with. But as already shown, energy comes in many different forms. So you could see actually heat, light, motion, electrical again. But now when we talk about nutrition, it is very much the chemical form in transforming molecules from one state to another that is actually the key to energy in biology. And another thing that is important to keep in mind is that energy does not disappear. It's not used. It's just transformed into another state. So you might have an input of energy through chemical bound energy. It will be, for example, oxidized, and then some will be lost as heat and used for other purposes, or producing other molecules that sort of takes over this energy from the original molecules. Again, you can end up being pretty confused when looking into energy units, because there's a lot or several different ones used, at least if you go broad and look chemistry, physics in general. In nutrition, we're often using either calories or kilocalories, and joule, often megajoule, kilojoule. And as I will show later, also, especially in the Danish market, we have a special energy unit, which I will try to define a little bit closer. But this one is a little bit difficult. When it comes to calories and joule, it's very easy to convert between the units of energy, because it's a fixed ratio. It's simply just two different ways of expressing the same. I know in some countries they prefer to work probably by tradition in calories, kilocalories. Other countries it's in joule or megajoules, and you see here the conversions between those two. So it can be done directly. When we move into the body, the sort of the active energy carrier in the body, in the cells, you could say, is ATP, which is actually a molecule that can be attached with three phosphorus groups. And as these phosphorus groups are released, then energy is sort of transferred or given or freed, and then. But you could see of course, these molecules are very small, because it does not seem of much that even 6 to 10, 20, what's it called, 10 to the 23rd ATP molecules actually contain only, you could say, 52 kilojoule, so 0.05 more or less megajoule. It's not a lot. But that's the term or the conditions of chemical energy. It's actually not very strong energy from our perspective, but the force is that there's a huge number of these molecules available, and they can be charged and recharged continuously. So you could say once the body, the organism utilizes energy from the food, it is sort of charging this molecule by attaching phosphorus to the molecule, and then it is used for transporting the energy to the targeted area in the body, and then this phosphorus group is again releasing energy for cellular work. So that's sort of in the cell, and you can see then the ADP plus the free phosphorus return and can again be charged. You could also show it like this, and consider it as basically a kind of battery. So this is how actually energy turnover occurs in the cells. But of course, the energy used to charge these molecules originally comes out of energy of food, or molecules already stored in the body, for example, fat. And when it comes to the bloodstream transporting energy from one place to another in the total organism, then often glucose is the intermediate molecule, but could also be fatty acids. So how do we actually measure feed or energy turnover in the animal and calculate how efficient is the animal actually in turning the energy from the feed into ultimately ATP? The theoretical chemical energy from the feed that will often be characterized with what is called a calorimetric bomb in the lab will often be higher than what can actually be utilized in the body, in the animal. But this whole thing is all measured in metabolic chambers, where some calculations and equations help us determine the efficiency. And you see glucose and fat is more or less the same. Efficiency roughly 70%, but if the animal has to utilize protein from the feed for ultimate energy in the body, well, it's not very efficient. Only 40% actually ends up as available energy on cell level. But metabolic chambers helps us to determine this, and this table shows the efficiency of the different transitions. If we have to use carbohydrates to transform into other types of carbohydrates or fat or so on, of course there's a difference. So the most effective is of course to a similar compound, but again, this makes the whole energy concept in biology and animal nutrition quite difficult. And this is probably also why we don't consider this in our everyday work. And you can see the losses as basically heat loss. As I said earlier, most transitions, mostly when we change energy, there's a loss through heat production. So when we talk about energy in nutrition, we have the gross energy, which is basically what you can measure in the lab in a sort of one of these calorimetric bombs. It utilizes all the energy, including heat energy, in any substance. Then, if we move on to digestible energy, already we have lost some energy. There's some lost for energy. There's or heat. There's some lost through digestion and transference of chemical compounds into others that can be absorbed, and the animal, of course, has some kind of loss through transportation, storage, remobilization, and so on. So this is the sort of the table that shows the different sorts. Originally, gross energy was used. Then, as we developed more in the nutrition, we moved on to digestible energy. But let me just start out by here saying, okay, the total gross energy is actually independent of feed quality, because it's, as it says, gross, and it can be calculated also as on the basis of a normal protein, carbohydrate, fat analysis, that this is the theoretical maximum energy available in the feed. Then, if we move on to the digestible energy, then a digestibility coefficient comes into the calculation. Of course, also some energy is not absorbed, so that's the fecal energy. So basically, you can say that the digestible energy is what stays behind in the animal. So basically, you could handle it by just analyzing the energy left in the feces, and the rest is digestible. Again, this comes with some disadvantages because it's not very precise. So next step was in the energy concept of nutrition to move on to the metabolizable energy. This is more what is actually available for metabolic processes in the animal. And as you see now, I have left out the actual equation because it becomes very complicated. But yeah, basically you can see metabolizable energy is gross energy minus the fecal energy, minus the urinary energy, minus whatever energy is bound in gases produced by the digestion. Or you could see that the digestible energy is basically gross energy minus fecal energy. So again, we take one more step, and many countries in the world, also I see a lot of scientific institutions are using this metabolizable energy because it is relatively easy, standardized to determine. The problem is that it's not always what the animals actually in real life experience. Why, of course, ongoing work always try to sophisticate the energy systems for nutrition, meaning the next step is actually net energy, which determines or expresses what kind of energy is actually deposited or used for production, including the maintenance of the bodily functions. And again, you see we have here the heat loss included as well in the equation. And there's different ways to determine this, but as we move down this ladder or tree, it becomes constantly more complicated to determine, and we need more and more to have a look at the animals, put them in some chambers, measure what is going on, instead of just basically calculating on the chemical composition. You could say net energy can be split again in this table into some basic maintenance energy and retained energy. So maintenance, of course, is whatever is constantly going on in the body. Retained energy is, you could say, is what is deposited in as chemical energy in the body. An example is, and the challenge is, the more we move down this table, the more individual or more different the values or the equations become between types of animals. Of course, between species, because the digesting does not work exactly the same way in all animals, but also actually within species. And this is an example of finisher pigs from one of the textbooks used at the Danish universities. If we take a look at the gross energy being 100% of the energy in this specific feed material, then you can say, okay, 20% is lost already in digestion. Then another 5% is lost when we move on to what is actually metabolizable. And then a big step is done when moving into net energy. But this is just an example, because this changes from animal group and which component are we actually looking at. But then again, the total energy can be broken down into energy for growth or retained energy, for maintenance, heat losses, energy bound in urine, and energy bound in feces. If we are looking at specific components, here is a comparison between barley and straw. And you see, of course, I know that they don't necessarily contain the same gross energy, but the fractioning is also different. You can see here, out of the total energy in barley, gross energy, the metabolizable and net energy is somewhat small. But if we move on to straw, actually net energy is much smaller than net energy in barley. Also metabolizable energy and digestible energy, but that's mainly because the energy in feces is so much higher. The animal simply cannot digest straw to the same extent. And also you see thermal energy. This table is not 100% correct, because you actually can experience higher thermal energy loss in straw than in barley, because there's a lot of or at least the fermentable parts will be fermented, and this leads to an energy production, and also energy to supply the microorganisms responsible for fermentation. When we move into energy systems, and keep in mind this is different from energy units, when we move into energy systems, it becomes very difficult to compare between systems, because these, as you see, it's different between the individual components used, how they are actually characterized. So, but in general, when we move from metabolizable to net energy and increase protein, then we have a decreasing utilization. And that's because then higher protein, actually we start initiate some other processes in the body, and for real, the net energy will actually be less relatively when higher protein compared to metabolizable. If fat increases, then again we actually increasing utilization because fat digests without producing so much heat. So we save a little bit. When it comes to crude fiber, it's a little bit different because crude fiber usually will mean less concentrated feed, which could, to some extent, to a certain limit, increase the feed intake. If crude fiber becomes very high, or maybe some with a lot of water binding fibers, actually it will limit feed intake. But the increased feed intake in general will decrease utilization because the passage rate will increase as well. So again, it's not easy, and there's no sort of defined and uniform translation units. Also, as you see here, have brought in from different species, but you see that not only body weight, but also whether the animal is fasting or has been fed during a trial, you will get different maintenance levels. So we're actually starting off on the wrong foot, so to speak, if we calculate maintenance without knowing if the animal is fasting or has been fed. The animal, the body is able to turn the maintenance to some extent up and down according to the energy status of the pig or the animal in general. So again, maintenance, yes, sometimes you will see, and generally in agriculture, of course, it's assumed that maintenance of animals has to be calculated for feeding animals being fed, because we are producing the animals for a reason, so it does not really make sense not to feed them. But there will be changes or differences. Then if we look into the Danish energy system in feed, some of you might have come across it, called feed units. I know the Dutch people earlier, at least, I don't know how much it's used anymore, but had also something similar. But from the original introduction, I think back in the early 70s, the Danish feed energy system has evolved. Today, it's actually a feed unit that you could also characterize as potential physiological energy. I'll come back to that. Besides analysis of nutrients, as we know in any other system, also the Danish system looks into an in vitro digestibility of organic matter in both at the ileum and total tract, to sort of estimate, have an extra level of digestibility included. And the equation, I've shown it in a sort of simplified form here, is a little bit different from growing animals until reproductive animals. But basically, you can see it is actually being calculated into joule or kilojoule in this matter of what we call PPE. And you see also these constants here are actually the energy for example, crude protein, energy for carbo or crude fat, sorry, And then it's split into easily digestible carbohydrates and fermentable carbohydrates, and then undigestible dry matter at the ileum. You see the main difference between the growing animals and the reproductive, or you could say grown animals, are actually the energy value of the fermentable carbohydrates. The other constants are the same. But I often come across a question that says, okay, if there's 12.5 megajoule ME in a feed, what does that equal in Danish units, or vice versa? And again, I have to say, across the countries, that you could actually see different equations for determining metabolizable energy. I've sort of put in here the German equation because that is what is sort of legal background or for in Germany. If you want to declare energy on your feed in Germany, you have to use this kind of equation. Again, there's two different equations, one for raw materials and one that is an estimate on feed, complete feed, because it's not fully additive. So again, there's some uncertainty built into the system. This is actually a fairly old table, but it can be found on the Danish SEGES website today, because this states the typical energy content in Danish is pig feed. However, I feel that this might need a little bit of an update, but I chose to leave it such. Often we see slightly higher energy content in the pre-starters, and unless you want to put in a lot of fiber components, it's actually relatively difficult to go below 1 feed unit sow in gestating feed. And again, piglets, growing piglets will often be slightly lower than what is stated here. But for not having to recalculate the entire table, I chose to put it in here. And you can see here this is potentially physiological energy, as I mentioned before, and you can see the values for sows and the values for growing animals per feed unit. But as you see, as I mentioned, you might experience different metabolizable energy values, also because often on university level they will actually do the chemical analysis and calculate the ME based on the actual analysis of the actual used feed, where this equation is more generic, trying to do something that can be used or applied on any feed formulation. Net energy, initially I spoke of net energy as something that was one thing, but again, different institutions have different equations. And this is again from the SEGES website, how they have characterized two of the more dominating systems, the French system of INRA and the Dutch system. And as you see, there's a difference, but as long as you are aware, you can navigate around in this. But interesting is that if we look into megajoule per Danish feed unit, actually there's a difference between the French and the Dutch system, where on the other hand there's a fairly good alignment of growing and pigs and sows. But again, this takes sort of this is based on, you could say, standard feed formulations and well, what is that? But you will experience that especially if the fiber content of the feed deviates a lot from standard, or then these comparisons cannot be used. But for estimation purposes, this table can be of use, but it can never replace an actual calculation. Right. So what is this energy actually good for? What is it used for? I mentioned already maintenance, but if we look into gestating animals specifically, of course, not surprising, energy for the cell turnover, cell multiplication, DNA multiplication, and protein fat synthesis of the fetuses, of the uterus, the fetal membrane, and also to the amniotic fluid. And of course, at the end of the gestation, also growth of the mammary gland. As you see on the diagram here, in the beginning actually of the gestation, there's not really a lot of energy for fetal growth, but it increases throughout the gestation period. On the other hand, the uterus, the placenta, and so on, have a higher demand at the beginning where it needs to grow and expand, and then eventually it actually becomes negative, meaning that the energy bound in these tissues, even though it's a fluid, one of them, is actually utilized through breaking down and release of energy. If we look into growing animals, of course, maintenance, which I should maybe have said earlier, it depends on body weight. So we cannot come up with one number for maintenance energy. It depends very much on body weight, which is normally calculated as the energy times metabolic body weight. And those of you who are nutritionists probably already know the term metabolic body weight. Of course, growing animals, the main source or the main utilization of energy is the deposition of, typo, so it should say fat and protein. And again, it depends on age and sex. I apologize, missed the full translation on this slide. But you can see here total energy intake and body weight. They are not completely the same. And that is mainly a matter of changes in maintenance. If we look into lactating animals, again, maintenance, of course, and milk production, not surprising. And this diagram shows net energy output in sow milk. And you can imagine, as there will be some losses, you can say, if you remember from one of the previous slides, net energy for finish at least made out only 55% of the gross energy in the feed. Then you can imagine that we need to multiply this to calculate how much energy intake is actually required through the feed. And this leads us to the fact that lactating animals often have an energy demand which cannot normally not be covered fully by the feed, why they will often be catabolic at some stages, meaning that they will be mobilizing energy from the body. Ideally, it should be done through fat mobilization because that's the purpose of depositing fat in the body. It's preserving energy for later use. Unfortunately, we see some farms where feed intake is very low, and also maybe back fat or body condition of the sows are not good enough that the sows will also start mobilizing protein. But again, if you remember one of the previous slides, this process is very ineffective. So it's and research also documents that it's actually detrimental to the performance of the sow in the coming litters. So Fiera and Tile some years ago did this modeling, partitioning the metabolic energy for sows, giving in the late gestation and lactation, and you can see more or less the same curve here. It's not as sharp, but you see here in the beginning, the maintenance is more or less the same all the way through, and you see the pink bars are actually heat loss. So it changes. There's a specific heat loss here at parturition, which of course is not surprising because everybody who's tried to do some hard work knows that you start sweating. There's a lot of heat production in the body. You also see here that mammary growth, the black part of the bars, is absolutely not dominating, but it actually continues quite down through to day 18th or around day 18th in lactation. You also see the fetal growth, and even though in the diagram earlier it looked like it was increasing dramatically, you see here that it does not really make out a lot compared to the maintenance level of the animal. And then when it comes to, no, I just want to say here you see again this example of a negative energy balance. It basically means that the sow gains some energy from breaking down some of the uteral components after giving birth, which will give some kind of energy addition to the body. But after, when it comes down to all this, of course, the milk production is by far the most dominating energy requirement during lactation. But also interesting to see there's actually quite some energy spent on milk production actually before parturition. And this is maybe why sometimes things go wrong if feed allowance is not increased sufficiently at the end of gestation. So you could see, comparing to a typical feeding curve, which is the slightly dotted line here, and the more coarsely dotted line shows the theoretical optimal energy supply. Actually, you see that in the red brownish areas we're actually supplying too much energy. In the blue area we cannot keep up, and this is where the sow starts mobilizing energy from the body. So the problem is that often we are not able to make the sows eat enough feed at this stage. People trying to really force or feed the sows very, very hard will experience often that the sows stop eating because they simply get too full. Just like ourselves, if we've been a few days, often over the holidays, eating and celebrating, then at some point we were, at least I feel like that, we could reach the level where we think, I cannot eat anything more. I don't want to eat ever again. And of course that's detrimental to the sows because it takes some time to get past this. So what can we then do? Well, in theory, by concentrating the feed to a level so that the voluntary feed intake actually can match the demand, but maybe we don't need to reach it 100% because my experience is that the sows that are able to and willing to mobilize fat from the body often are the ones performing the best. So we might not need to the full extent reach this. We've developed a feed recommendation diagram. Of course, there's also a table sort of exemplifying this, saying, okay, we need, of course, during gestation, we need to make sure that the body condition is correct. Often, if the sows are a little bit out of line on body condition at the end of lactation, well, we do have some time to fix it, and but the main objective is that the body condition needs to be within the desired area just before going into parturition. And the reason why we have a range in feed recommendation during lactation, of course, is that large sows need more feed than smaller sows, and large litters also need more feed for milk than smaller litters. But in generally, there's a little bit difference in the genetics from my experience. And of course, also climate influences the feed intake, the voluntary feed intake of the sows. Cooler weather normally means it's easier to reach a higher feed intake. Hot weather naturally limits the feed intake, and this is a challenge every year in some countries. Just to put in the feeding curve this is just a table version of what I just showed you. So with some with some ideas or suggestions of how to adapt the late gestation. This one shows a single step increase at the end of the gestation. There's an alternative approach saying, okay, we'll take a 2-step approach. So because we sometimes see that sows, when increasing them more than 1 kilo per day, they actually do struggle keeping up a little bit in gestation. So sometimes it can be beneficial to start out a little earlier with a slight increase, and then at the last part a little bit later. If we look at the lactation, of course, the whole thing about protein and lysine, it's a completely different question than what we are talking about today. It will be actually the next webinar. I'll be looking a little bit more into protein and amino acids. But the objective through lactation is to have a high milk production, of course, and a limited body weight loss. I think normally my experience is that anywhere from 15 to 20 kilos of body weight loss is acceptable, but as I said, it should only be fat. They should not start mobilizing protein. Nutritionally, from the diagrams we saw before, you can see that what the sows need in the beginning, it's actually until day 3 after pasteurization, it's mainly an energy, because there's not really a big demand for protein. Once they start really producing in milk, so in the actual lactation period, once we are past the colostrum, both energy and protein is very important. So if feed intake is impaired, of course, increasing energy and protein concentration could be considered. But again, the only way to concentrate energy mostly is often to increase fat. And this can come with some other challenges, because there's a limit. We see that often that if we go past for anywhere between 4 and 5% added fat to the diets, first of all, they can become difficult on pellet quality, but also the sows might decrease the feed intake, probably due to palatability or something like that. Basically, the sows should eat what they are served within 30 minutes through lactation. All right. When we move on to growing pigs, it's a little bit different because in general, they should just eat as much as possible, at least in the early stages, because there's a strong correlation, of course, not surprising, between feed intake and daily gain. This is just a diagram to show the different phases in the piglet unit. And if we move on to finishes, it will be similar. Some farms work with limiting the feed intake at the end to sort of optimize feed conversion ratio and in some countries also lean meat. But it comes with a cost, because often when you limit feed intake, you will also limit daily gain. So you need to make up, based on your own experiences, what is actually the ideal strategy. Something called Gompertz, or a guy called Gompertz, did actually work out some equations some years ago that describes the sort of general bodily growth. And when you model the growing period of pigs based on the Gompertz equation, in this case it's calculated on feed units or PPE, you could say that based on input on what is the target or what is the actual feed conversion of feed intake, you could actually calculate what is it based on what is the daily feed intake, expected feed intake, or what should the feeding curve be if you're using a feed curve right from the start. I've made 4 different calculations, one from 800 to 1,100 grams per day standard, meaning from 30 to 100 kilo. And this is why, of course, if we look into it, I don't think anybody is using 30 to 100 kilo or slaughtering the pigs at 100 kilos today. but that's sort of been a more or less established standard that are now changing slightly. But you can see not surprising, the fastest growing pigs, the green line here, of course, quickly will get heavier. But you see here, what we see is that the feed intake is actually leveling out according to this equation. And if we then move on to the feed conversion, it doesn't really. But so the leveling out of the feed intake is more a matter of a leveling out and eventually a decrease in daily gain once the pigs get bigger and older. But by using this equation, either putting in the desired levels or basing it on current experience, current values of the farm, it's possible to estimate what should theoretically be the ideal situation on energy. And again, of course, energy cannot do it alone. We also have to work with the protein supply. A thing is also that pigs are constantly getting more energy efficient. It's a simple matter of selection, genetic selection, because in the breeding companies, they always try to feed pigs slightly above the demand on both energy and other nutrients, to make sure that the animals that actually have the genetic potential to utilize it better than the average also gets a chance to express this genetic ability. But also over years, of course, this means that the genetic moves a little bit away from what it was. And this means that we also have to change our feed approach, saying, okay, if an animal 15 years ago needed so much protein per energy, well, if the pigs become more and more energy efficient, we need to increase the protein per energy. And that's actually what we've seen in Denmark within the last 10 years, that we've seen twice actually on lactation feed, that the recommendations on protein per energy have increased, and a constant actually adaptation through a dynamic approach on growing pigs. You can see here that this is the development in the Danish market of FCR in feed unit in energy, and you see that they become constantly more efficient. This reference again sort of says, okay, if we standardized all pigs in the data set to from 30 to 115 kilos in this case, we would have a feed conversion of exemplified by the orange line. And the difference, of course, means that the pigs in real life, the pigs recorded, represents a variation in entry weight and final body weight. And what I also think is interesting is looking at the green and yellow line here. That is actually the best 25% best farms. So they are more or less the ones who shows us what is actually the potential. I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's the direction of the diagram is going up here at the end. Probably it will level out again. When it comes to a feed intake, you see there's not really a big difference between the best and the average, and this means that the best is not, they don't necessarily eat more, they simply just utilize the feed better, as expressed in this diagram, and they simply grow more on the same feed. And of course, in finisher production, especially as feed is the main cost factor, this is very interesting that they can utilize the feed more. So summary is that energy is not a nutrient, but it's still very important. It makes everything else flow. Energy transporter, well, sorry, I put body here, it's in the cell, it's ATP, ADP. Energy comes in different versions or units that are not directly comparable. It has something to do with availability and digestibility and losses. Energy can be derived from all nutrients, both carbohydrates, fat, protein, and other compounds as well. In theory, organic acids as well, but as they are basically fatty acids, well, they are actually covered under the term fat. Carbohydrate and fat is the preferred or the main energy carrier in the feed, usually it's very inefficient and expensive way to supply energy through protein. Protein should be used for muscle gain and tissue gain instead. Energy is used for all biological processes, maintenance, immune system, protein and fat deposition, of course, one of the most important. Protein mobilization, if that's needed, again, it's undesirable, but we do see it sometimes, and milk production. And feed allowance, as all bodily processes is depending on energy. Actually, feed allowance is more a matter of energy than of kilos. The problem is just that it can be more difficult to measure and calculate and control the energy. To detail, it's much easier just to work with kilos. And eventually I showed you that the growing pigs are constantly getting more and more energy efficient. So that was what I chose. There's a lot more to say about energy, but I didn't want to make it too technical, too academic. I hope everybody had a pretty good idea now about differences and challenges, issues when looking into energy, and especially when trying to connect across different energy systems, different countries and traditions. If you found it interesting and want to participate in more of our webinars, the upcoming webinar is on cattle, a good start for calves, right use of milk replacer and prevention of gut problems. The upcoming pig webinars are the two next webinars in this Nutrition Basics series. The next one will be on protein in pig feed, and the last one will address micronutrients and additives in pig feed. So thank you for your participation, and should there be any questions, even though time is quite, I've been speaking a little bit too long, sorry for that. But if there was a few questions, please come up with them.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Until now, we have 3 questions to you, but everyone is welcome to write more questions in the chat if you want. The first question is, what is the determining factor for energy content and feed materials?
Yeah, the determining content, of course, is the composition and the distribution of carbohydrates, fat, and protein. When it comes to gross energy, when it comes to digestibility, of course, it might mainly be the distribution of the carbohydrates. How much is in starch, how much are in fiber, and which can be fermented, and so on. So actually, the chemical composition of the feed, not only protein, fat, carbohydrates, but also within carbohydrates, and to some extent actually also within fat, what types of fat are included in component.
Okay. What is the optimal energy level in lactation feed?
Again, as I mentioned, it's difficult to come up with an specific, because it depends very much on the feed intake. But the first step to be done is actually to evaluate how much can I actually make the sows eat at the different stages. Try to estimate the sort of the limiting time point on lactation. Say, okay, I need to have this much milk, and the energy demand is actually at this level. This can be calculated into an actual energy content of the feed. But again, hot conditions, low feed intake, it needs to be more concentrated than under cool conditions. Gastric ulcers influences also the voluntary feed intake of the sows. Again, more concentrated feed. But in general, expressed in Danish feed units, and then you can calculate it, translate it into your preferred energy units by estimation, would be anywhere from 1.06 to 1.08 feed units per kilo.
Okay. Why can't we convert directly between energy units?
Yeah, it's also a challenge to sometimes to understand, but it's basically because the different energy units calculates on different levels, so to speak. So to put it very simple and very short, the different energy units or systems take the energy losses into consideration in a different way. So that's the main difference between the systems. So you could say the losses are not the same in the systems. This is why you cannot convert directly linearly between them. And it depends on the components used again. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Jakob. There come no more questions. Yeah, and everyone can see the webinar also on our homepage afterwards, all our webinars. And yes, thank you very much for listening. And thank you, Jakob.
Thank you.